Hello and welcome to our Life Sciences lessons. Today we're going to be looking at the first lesson in a series on the history of life. Let's have a look and see what it entails. We know about the history of life from fossils. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is a little bit about fossils. What are fossils? How do fossils come about? Are there different types of fossils? And then later on we will look at what the fossils are telling us. For this lesson, these are the topics we're going to be covering. We're first going to look at how fossilization occurs, what types of fossil there are, how we know how old they are, because we're going to be talking in millions of years, put all the information together in a timeline of what's happened on the Earth over many years, and then we will look at what causes the changes in what we find. First of all, what is a fossil? And a fossil is basically the remains of some hard parts of animals that have actually turned to stone. A fossil looks exactly like a bone, but it is actually stone. And if we look at this picture, that is a fossil mammoth, and all of these bones that you see are actually stone. So we're going to have a look at a little bit more about how fossils work. Oh, we also find fossils of not parts of the animals, but signs that they've actually been there, like footprints in ancient mud. And all of these fossils tell scientists a story about what life was like many millions of years ago. First thing we need to look at is how do living things, when they die, how do they actually become fossils? And that's the process of fossilization. And this picture gives us an overview of exactly what has to happen to form a fossil. Because not all animals that lived on Earth actually became fossils. A very small percentage of them only. Let's have a look. First of all, the animal has to die, preferably near a river, so the bones can be buried. Then, soft parts decay, leaving only the bones. Because it's near a river, sediment gets laid down over the bones. And over many years, many layers of sediment are brought down by rivers and cover the skeleton. As millions of years go by, water percolates through the rock, goes into the skeleton, and the skeleton actually changes to rock. Because of movement of the earth and river action, the layers are removed by erosion, and eventually the fossil is exposed so scientists can actually have a look at it and try and work out what went on. Step number one. Okay, first of all, the animal has to die. The soft parts decay and only the hard parts get left behind. Then the animal has to be buried. Sediments have to be laid down on top of the skeleton. This occurs over many, many years. And eventually, mineralization occurs, which is when minerals go into the teeth and bones and convert them to a fossil. So the fossil is basically a combination of the original bone and the new minerals. Now this takes millions of years. Erosion occurs, rocks get pushed upwards, water carves into the rock, and we end up with the fossils being exposed. And only then do scientists actually know there is a fossil there, and they can then start examining it and seeing what we can learn from that. For example, the earth under our feet this very minute might look like that. It might have hundreds of fossils in it, but we will never know until some sort of excavation occurs or the landscape is eroded away by water. Now, there are different types of fossil. They all give us information, but they're formed in a slightly different way. So let's have a look at these different types of fossils. Okay, the most useful ones are body fossils, which are basically parts of a skeleton. For example, this picture here is a fossil of a sea mollusk. So, body fossils can only form from the hard parts. And sometimes, as in this example, the fossilization actually shows you that the animal's body, when it was alive, was made of lots of little compartments. So sometimes you can see internal detail. The most common fossils are the ones shown here, what we call mineralized or petrified fossils, which bones become stone. Then other things can happen. For example, these two pictures are carbonized fossil, when the carbon in the living organism undergoes a chemical change, and that is how coal is produced. So coal is actually a fossil. Then these are very, very interesting, because sometimes living things can be preserved in different ways. For example, this here, that is a stone, but it's a fossil of tree resin, and you can see an insect got trapped in that tree resin. And the insect is now part of the fossil. This picture here is very interesting because this is a baby mammoth that was actually discovered as the ice sheet retreated in Siberia. That little mammoth had been frozen in ice for hundreds of thousands of years. And in this exact same situation, this is a picture of a man, and that is a mammoth tusk. And as the ice is melting in Siberia, many of these mammoth tusks are actually being exposed, and people are going out collecting them and then giving them to museums or selling them. But boy, isn't that rather large? Another type of fossil is what we call a mold. And what happens there, the organism gets trapped, the sediment hardens, and the organism decays afterwards. And if you have a look at this picture, you can see that is a mold, because you can see the animal was there, it's not there anymore, but you can see its shape quite clearly. Then, what sometimes happens is other minerals fill the shape, and then the fossil is called a cast. But if you look inside a cast, you can't see any internal detail, as we saw in the body fossil. Then, the last ones are trace fossils. And there are many trace fossils. Sometimes it's footprints. They even have fossil dung, which actually tells them quite a lot about what the animals ate. Okay, this is a series of dinosaur footprints. Hundreds of million years ago, a dinosaur walked on soft mud. And just to give you an idea of how large the dinosaur feet were, those are the 3 toes compared to a human hand. That brings us to the end of the first section, which is looking at fossilization. But before your brains start bursting, let's take a break. Welcome back from your break. We're going to carry on looking at fossils, but what we're going to be looking at now is how do scientists know how old fossils are? You've probably heard dinosaurs existed so many million years ago, but how do scientists know that they actually did exist that time? And scientists have worked it out by working out how old the fossils are or dating the fossils. And there are 2 methods that scientists use for dating fossils. The most accurate method is the second method, and that tells you how many million years each particular fossil is. First type of trying to work out which fossils are older is something called relative dating. And because fossils are found in sediments which are laid down in water, the oldest fossils are always at the bottom. And as more sediments get laid down, more fossils get laid down, and the younger fossils are actually at the top. And this is called the principle of superposition. In other words, the lower ones are old, the lower layers are older than the upper layers. And this is a picture of the Grand Canyon in America, and the Grand Canyon, from top to bottom, lays open 300 million years of fossils. And the oldest fossils would be right at the bottom in these white layers here, and the younger fossils would be closer to the top. The most scientific, the most accurate way of dating is called absolute dating. In other words, it gives you a figure, and it's also called radiometric dating because of the technique used to actually work out the age. This is more accurate, and it is a little bit complicated, so I'll try and explain it as simply as I can. First of all, in any minerals of any type, there are some atoms that are radioactive, and those are the ones that are shown here in red. And scientists know what the proportion of radioactive atoms actually are. When an organism dies, those radioactive atoms gradually decay or break down, and here they're shown in green. So scientists can look, and according to how many of the atoms that were radioactive have broken down, they can work out how old the rock is. The time taken for half of the radioactive atoms to break down is called a half-life. And the figure for a half-life is different in different elements. For example, this picture shows uranium, and uranium is one of the common elements that is used to do this radiometric dating. Uranium breaks down to lead. And for half of the uranium atoms to break down, it takes 1 billion years. So the half-life of uranium is 1 billion years. So when scientists look at uranium, they just work out how many of the uranium atoms are still radioactive, and that gives them an idea of how old the rock is. Now, not all elements are good for this. There are 3 elements that are very suitable. The one is uranium, which we looked at. The other one is potassium, and there's another one that you might have heard of, and that is carbon dating. And each of these 3 different elements gives us an idea of how old the rocks are. Uranium and potassium are used to date very old rocks, and carbon dating is used for organic matter from 50,000 years ago to now. Now, this might sound complicated, but once the scientists have worked it all out, it's actually quite easy to do, because they take a Geiger counter which can measure radioactivity, they measure how much radioactivity is in the rock, and then they look at a graph like this. And they can then work out if half of the atoms have decayed, they will look and say, aha, this rock is so many years old. And it's different for the different elements. To make it a bit easier for you, we're going to have a look at how radiocarbon dating is actually used. Radiocarbon dating, the half-life is 5,000 years. So if they find, like for example, that baby mammoth we talked about, they would simply measure the radioactivity in that baby mammoth, and they would say, okay, 50% of that baby mammoth's radioactivity has been gone or has decayed, and that tells us that the baby mammoth was 5,000 years old. Now, to compare the 2 different types of dating, we have relative dating here. So let's have a look. Relative dating, that can only tell you which is the oldest and which is the youngest rock. Absolute dating, which is the radiometric dating, that can give you much more accurate figures. And if you have a look, if they work out, it's 120 million years. The margin for error is about 10 years, so it might be 125 million years old. As the rock gets older, the margin of error gets a little bit bigger, but it still gives us a good idea of how long ago those organisms existed. Now, what time frame are we talking about? Scientists have estimated that the Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. That's 4.6 thousand million years. The figures are quite mind-boggling. And in those 4.6 billion years, things have changed quite a lot. The Earth changed from a hot, inhospitable sphere to a place where life could exist. And of course, humans are the end product of life on Earth. If we have a look at this diagram, that's the start of the Earth 4.6 billion years ago, and that's now where we are. This shows us all sorts of things that happened. The important ones is that way back here, that was when the first evidence of life existed. They found fossils of tiny, tiny microscopic organisms, but they were very simple organisms. It's only much later that proper cells developed, cells with a nucleus. And for most of the time in history, any things that were alive were all unicellular. And it's only about 800 million years ago that multicellular organisms were first found in the fossil record. And if we have a look, some of them are very strange and do not exist today. Then, of course, we also had our favorites, the dinosaurs, which existed, well, 100 million years ago. But in terms of the Earth's age, that was actually quite recent. Because a timeline like this is extremely confusing, we are going to be looking at a simplified version of the timeline, and we are only going to be looking at living things and things that affected living things. So let's have a look at the timeline we're going to use. Okay, this blue square is our timeline, starting at the beginning, the origin of the Earth, 4.6 million years ago, and right at the top is the present time. And 2/3 of the way along, 3,000 million years ago, and 1,500 million years ago. And what we're going to do is we're going to be having a look at what happened as time moved from ancient Earth a long time ago and how it changed to conditions that we have on Earth now. And that is how we look at a timeline showing us what happened on the Earth in the past. Welcome back from your break. We are going to have a look at a timeline which shows us the history of the Earth. So, let's get started. The blue bar is the timeline with the dates filled in, and we are going to be looking at certain points on this timeline and seeing, well, what was the Earth like at that particular time in history? What types of animals existed at that particular time, if any? $4,600 million years ago, Earth was formed. It formed from dust and gases from the solar system. And if we look at the picture, not a very hospitable place to live. It was a molten sphere, hot temperatures. The atmosphere had carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen, water vapor, no oxygen. It wasn't a very nice place to live because the Earth was so hot, volcanoes were erupting. There wasn't an atmosphere to stop meteorites from out of space hitting the Earth. So this is what it looked like. Volcanic eruptions, meteorites hitting the Earth. Not a very hospitable place for life to exist. About 4,000 million years ago, the first life on Earth came into being. These were simple cell-like structures, not even proper cells, and they didn't contain DNA, they contained RNA. But they were alive. Then, 3,900 million years ago, proper cells, life as we know it, with DNA, came into being. These were simple prokaryotic cells. And you should know from what you've done on cells that the word prokaryotic means that they didn't have a nucleus. They were very simple organisms similar to the bacteria which exist today. But these were very different because there wasn't any oxygen. So they used carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and inorganic minerals. And this is an example of a hot spring that exists today, and sulfur forms the yellow in the hot springs, and even today there are some of these very, very simple bacteria which don't need oxygen. They use sulfur, carbon dioxide, and energy from the hot springs to be able to survive. Then, 3,500 million years ago, bacteria, as we know them, existed, and these were weird because they used light to photosynthesize. So they could make their own food, they didn't have chlorophyll, and they didn't give off oxygen. But these at least were closer to the bacteria that we know today. Then, 3,000 million years ago, the first proper photosynthetic bacteria, which are called cyanobacteria, they had chlorophyll and they used light to produce food by photosynthesis, and they released oxygen as a waste product. They had a primitive type of chlorophyll. Now, these cyanobacteria exist today, and the picture shows some of the cyanobacteria that are actually found in water today. Fossils of these bacteria exist. And this is a place in Australia, and all of these funny looking mounds are actually stromatolites, and they are fossils of these very, very simple photosynthetic bacterial cells that lived all those millions of years ago. Now, time's going by. The cyanobacteria are busy undergoing photosynthesis, and this causes the oxygen levels to rise. And that poisoned many of the bacteria that relied on carbon dioxide. Because the photosynthetic bacteria were using carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide levels dropped. So the composition of the atmosphere is changing. Then, 2,000 million years ago, the first eukaryotic cells develop. What does eukaryotic mean? We know that eukaryotic means that they have got a proper nucleus, and if we look at this picture, there's the nucleus. That's why it's eukaryotic. But the important thing is they also had organelles. Okay, and here are some of the organelles in this particular unicellular organism. Scientists think that organelles probably arose when cells engulfed other bacteria and did not digest them, and the other bacteria kept on living inside them and helping them to survive. $800 million years ago, the first multicellular organisms occur. And they were probably produced by unicellular organisms that clumped together. For example, in this picture here, there are a whole lot of unicellular organisms clumped together, and they found that when they stayed together, they were safer. And they then started carrying out different life functions and helping each other out. And that is how multicellular organisms came into existence. Then, 550 million years ago, there was such a big change. Because from the simple microscopic bacteria and some multicellular cells which had existed for 150 million years, within a relatively short space of time, and I'm talking about geological time, so it's about 10 million years is a relatively short space of geological time, all these weird and wonderful different living things came into existence. And that is called the Cambrian Explosion. And that is when life exploded onto the scene in all its amazing diversity. This is an artist's impression of some of the weird organisms which existed. We still find some today that are quite similar, but there are quite a lot that do not exist in that form today. Oh, there's also a little snail, a little mollusk. But 430 million years ago, living things started being able to grow onto land. Animals left the sea and developed the ability to walk on land. As the sea levels dropped, some plants managed to survive on land. So after that time, land ecosystems also came into being. And that, in a nutshell, is the history of the Earth. I think your brains are a bit bursting by now, so let's take a break. Welcome back to our life sciences lesson on fossils and fossilization and the history of the Earth. What we've looked at so far in this section is we've looked at fossilization, how it occurs, how fossils are made. We then looked at the different types of fossils. We looked at fossil dating, which means how do we know how old the different types of fossils are. And then we have just finished looking at a timeline of the history of the Earth. And what we're going to be looking at now is we're going to be looking at some of the changes that happened in the Earth to cause all these weird and wonderful living things to be able to exist. So what we're now looking at what are the changes that have actually occurred over time, and why did they cause living things to change? Okay, first thing is in the last 400 million years, the continents have moved. For example, 400 million years ago, this is what the Earth looked like. There was North America, South America, Asia, Africa, India, which was actually part of Africa, and Australia, and Antarctica. They were all part of a huge continent. They were all joined together, and that continent was called Pangaea. And because all the continents were joined, animals could easily move from one of the continents to the other. Plants, their seeds could be blown, and we would find plants moving across this huge continent called Pangaea. But it didn't stay like that, because the continents gradually drifted apart. And we call that Continental Drift. So let's have a look at what's happening. There's Africa, and you can see there, Europe and Asia has now split from Africa. India has split from Africa, and Antarctica and Australia were still together 200 million years ago. If we look at 130 million years ago, you can see what's happening to India. India was rushing along on its way to join the rest of Asia, where it actually is now. Okay, if we look at 70 million years ago, India was still an island. North America was still joined. There's North America. It was still joined to Asia, and North and South America were totally separate from each other, as was Africa. Then, if we look today, you can see the position of all the continents in the world today. Very different to what it was 200 million years ago. Now, an important thing to notice is that as these continents moved, they moved from near the poles to near the equator, or from near the equator to near the poles. So conditions changed quite a bit. And we can see this quite clearly because in Antarctica, which is now covered by a huge ice sheet, they found fossils of tropical plants, like ferns, which tells us that at one time Antarctica was actually a tropical place. India, which is now very, very hot, was at one time in the South Pole. So continental drift changed conditions quite a lot as the continents moved. Another interesting point is, how do we actually know that the continents did move? And one of the pieces of evidence that shows that continental drift did occur is something called biogeography. And that's looking at where the fossils of certain living organisms that existed in the past are actually found. And this supports the theory of continental drift, and let's have a look at some of those at the moment. Okay, first of all, showing that Africa and South America were once joined are fossil remains of certain types of reptile. Also showing that America, South America, and Africa were joined are fossil remains of something that almost looked like a crocodile. But then, even more interesting, some of the other distribution of certain living things shows, okay, and if we look here, okay, this is where we find fossils of a particular very, very interesting fern, and it's found in South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. And that actually gives the scientists the evidence they need to know that their theory of continental drift is actually a true theory. It also helps us understand how evolution occurs. And when you get to matric and you have a look at evolution, you'll find an understanding of this biogeography very useful. Then, other things that happened is the temperature of the world changed. From the hot molten ball that it was 400 million years ago, it became a frozen wasteland. There were ice ages. In fact, there were several ice ages, and between them there were periods of global warming. So the world temperatures changed, and there were several periods of warming and cooling, and that led to at least 5 ice ages. And this is what the Earth looked like, covered in ice. Have you ever seen the movies Ice Age? They're actually based on fact because, for example, mammoths did exist. And mammoths did survive the ice ages because they had these lovely, lovely thick coats. Saber-toothed tigers did exist. Giant sloths like Sid the Sloth did exist. Now, in an ice age, conditions change. Life doesn't become so easy. Let's have a look. The whole world becomes frozen. Plants can't survive because the water they need to survive is frozen. Herbivores need plants. No plants? The herbivores have to migrate to find plants that they can eat, to find food. If the herbivores migrate, the carnivores, like saber-toothed tigers, also have to migrate because they have to go where their food is. And in the Ice Age movies, they have the Great Migration. And that shows that as the world became colder and colder, there was no food. And to be able to survive, living things had to migrate. So those movies are actually based on what scientists have been able to work out about what really happened in those ice ages. During these ice ages, as the temperature changed, because much of the water became part of the ice, the sea levels dropped. That meant that something which was on the sea floor became land. So any animal which existed then, as the sea dried up, it had to adapt to be able to survive. Then, when it got warmer, the sea levels rose. So large areas which were land have now become sea. And we have fossils that actually tell us this. For example, this picture here is the fossil of a whale which is found in the Sahara Desert, in the middle of the desert. Because the Sahara was once part of the Mediterranean Sea. It was once part of the sea floor. Even our own Karoo, dry, hot, and dusty, has many different fossils in it which once lived in water, because the entire Karoo was once an inland lake. So temperature changes also affected the sea levels. Temperature changes also affected gases, and that's what we're going to look at now. As time went by and the temperature got warmer, photosynthesis occurred, the proportion of gases in the atmosphere changed. And any organism which needed a particular gas to survive, if that gas wasn't available, guess what? It didn't survive. So as the composition of gases like CO2 and oxygen in the atmosphere changed, organisms which needed those gases died out and became extinct, while other organisms developed ways to use those gases, and they then became more common because they knew how to live in the changed atmosphere of the Earth. Hopefully, this has given you an idea of how things have changed in the 4,600 million years since the Earth came into being. I hope that what we have done has given you a bit of insight into the history of our Earth. See you next time.